Hey, excuse me for being late. I had some trouble finding the login.
Uh, I should have highlighted it in that email I sent you yesterday. All right, so we are about to start the recording. So once we have started the recording, um, we will introduce Buzz and get to it. And we'll turn off those chimes for people appearing. So tonight's session is Buzz Barstow. What's next in systems and synthetic biology for sustainable energy? I will probably say that again once the YouTube recording has started. So welcome, Buzz.
It's already started.
Oh, it has started. Okay, sorry. I thought I would see that when it was. It has already started, but I will say that again anyway. Welcome to Science in the Virtual Pub. Well, tonight's speaker is Dr. Buzz Barstow, Associate Professor in Biological and Environmental Engineering at Cornell University, and he will be talking about what's next in systems and synthetic biology for sustainable energy. And I'm going to stop sharing and hand it over to Buzz. Welcome, Buzz.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen, and I hope this works. So
It does.
something works. Okay, fantastic. So I hope when I press play on my slides that you see it.
Yes, you have gone to full screen, looking good.
Great. I'm always a little bit sort of trepidatious about doing presentations over Zoom these days because I feel very much out of practice with it. But I'll see how I do tonight.
I have confidence in you, Buzz.
Thank you. I hope I have. I'm not sure if I have confidence in myself, but I've made about 20 slides, and I know we have about an hour. And I would, I would encourage anybody in the audience, to interrupt me really anytime they like. I gave a very similar set of slides downtown at a bar under the State Street Theater about a month ago. And what was supposed to be an hour turned into sort of a 2 hour discussion about the sort of the moral implications of this, and I'm always happy to have that discussion. To be quite honest, so ask away. If we don't get to the end, I'm not. I won't be crying or anything. So my lab, we work. I'm originally a physicist. I did my PhD in applied physics with Sol Gruner, who I see in the audience. At Cornell. But this was like this wasn't really an entry. In some ways, it was sort of an end of my physics education, but it was the very beginning of my education in biology. And it gave me a great sort of it gave me a great sort of worldview to think about how we could apply biology to the challenges of energy. Before I get started, I always like to thank the people involved. I'm sure I'm missing people here, but this wouldn't be possible without these people. These sort of funders, you name it. We recently had an election, and even more recently, we had an inauguration. But despite what you might think, I don't think the need for sustainable energy is going to go away. I actually gave my faculty interview at Cornell. I think it was it was either the day after or the day before President Trump was sworn in for the first time. And I thought, my God, nobody in their right mind is going to invest, is going to invest a startup package in a assistant professor who wants to engineer microbes to solve the energy and climate challenges. But what am I going to do? But I'd read this article by I actually was corrected in the pub downtown. I don't think this actually is the first scientific article ever published by a sitting or otherwise US president. Jimmy Carter might have actually written something. But just before he left office, President Obama wrote a series of articles. One of them was in Science magazine about the irreversible momentum of clean energy. And sort of in summary, says, you know, billions in this next century, between now and the 2100, billions of people who now live, in the third world are going to want to enter the first world. They may well be successful in doing that. So if this is done right, and you can't bet against this, right? You don't want to bet against this, because if it's done right, this is going to be one of the greatest opportunities ever presented to improve global public health. Energy use correlates very well with quality of life. And if we increase energy use, we increase public health. At least you have the chance to. So, the need for sustainable energy has never been greater. And it'll only continue to grow as the century goes on. Whoever is in the White House, Obama argued, and I think he was right, this momentum can't be stopped. Now, I'd like to talk briefly, we're talking about, what's going to happen in the next century. Maybe we could think even beyond there. And I'm gonna share a few slides from a talk I gave on Carl Sagan's birthday a couple of months ago. Frank Drake, another professor at Cornell, and one of the originators of the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. In the late 1950s, when he started looking for alien civilizations with radio telescopes, he came up with this equation, later was called the Drake equation, to estimate how many civilizations he might observe. Now, over the past 70 years almost, the terms in this equation, starting from the left-hand side, have started to be filled in by astronomers. Things like, the rate of star formation, the fraction of planets with stars. We actually know this number pretty well now. Now, you might think I'm a biologist, I'm going to talk about the middle term, the probability that life emerges. As interesting as that is, I'm not going to talk about it today. What I'm actually really interested in are the last two terms in the equation on the right-hand side that I've colored in red. There's the length of time that civilizations are observable, and then the probability that we'll recognize what we're looking at. I think the Drake equation, in some way, it is about aliens, but I think really it's about humanity. It's about this very deep question: how long will our civilization last? And I think the best way to answer that is actually just to try and make it last as long as we possibly can with technology. Maybe with moral advances as well, but I think that's a little bit out of my purview, somewhat out of my purview as a technologist. Ellie Arroway, the heroine of the movie Contact that Carl Sagan wrote, thought this question of how long does a civilization last, she thought it was so important that she said it was going to be the first question that she would ask aliens. In one of my favorite scenes from Contact, there's this they've got this machine, and they're going to send a person through it to meet vegans, not vegans. And there's a panel to decide, and the French representative says, I've got one final question, Dr. Arroway. If you should meet these vegans, because the transmission came from the star Vega, and we're permitted only one question to ask of them, what would it be? And she says, well, I suppose it'd be, how did you do it? How did you evolve? And how did you survive this technological adolescence without destroying yourself? this, the doom right here, it could be nuclear war. I think that's what Carl Sagan was really thinking about when he wrote this. It could be climate change. It could be artificial intelligence, biological warfare, all number of hazards that come about because of advanced technology. But I don't think that turning the clock back on technology, I don't think it'll work. And I don't know that it'd be right to do so, even if we could, in fact. Um, so I've plotted two graphs here from our world in data. On the left-hand side, the conclusion I draw from this is that life expectancy, and if there were, I don't know that life expectancy is a perfect measure of quality of life, but I would have a hard time coming up with a sort of a better, more general one. Um, Life expectancy sort of needs money, right? Like the richer you are, generally speaking, the longer you live. And likewise, money, GDP per capita needs energy use. That's the graph on the right-hand side. So you could argue, right, and I would argue, right, that an imperative of a responsible government is to increase energy availability. Um, and it's possible, to imagine even more advanced civilizations using even more energy than we do. A physicist called Kardashev, a Soviet physicist called Kardashev, came up with this idea of later was called the Kardashev scale in the 1960s, that denoted the level of advancement of a civilization by its energy use. But how are you going to do this? How are you going to? The question we face this century, human civilization faces, is how do you do this without wrecking your home world? How do we do it without wrecking the earth with climate change, with carbon pollution? Um, and I think the best way to answer this question is to do it ourselves, is to figure out how we can expand energy use without polluting the atmosphere. We can project energy use far into the future. Here's the Kardashev scales, and I'll walk you through it. Sort of down, on the bottom left-hand side of the screen. Uh, Sagan had it was this is a little bit of a wag thing to do, right? He said, a type zero civilization, it corresponds to about an energy use comparable to about 100 campfires, sort of the smallest possible unit of civilization. A type one civilization makes use basically of all the sunlight incident on its home planet. Human civilization today is a little bit under one, and you'll see this. And I hope I can somehow figure out a way to make a laser pointer. Maybe I can't, and you'll have to forgive me if I can't.
I think you're just moving your cursor across. It should
I think
show
I
up.
am. If you look carefully here, um, today we're at a Kardashev level of about 0.75. By the end of the century, we'll be at about 0.8. How do we get there? And again, how do we get there responsibly? So I think I would argue that future technology might look a lot more like biology than technology today does. So, as well as manipulating matter at enormous scales, right? The physicist John Barrow in the 1970s, he made the sort of supposition that as civilizations, I wrote the word mature here, and I don't actually love it, right? As they get more advanced, right? Mature kind of implies an end state, and I think thinking about end states is not a great idea. I think it leads to some hubris. They're going to manipulate their environment with increasing precision, but do so at very large scale. And if you think about it, this actually sounds a lot like biology. Um, Somebody once said the biology has molecular precision coupled with global scale. Um, in fact, sci-fi has science fiction has got there in some ways before sci-fi did, before real science did. Here are a few of my favorite examples. In particular, Babylon 5 is a bit of a silly TV show from the 90s that I love, and I'll talk anybody's ear off about. Below that is the much more serious Arthur C. Clarke's 2010, where the famous monolith turns out it can self-replicate, and it can do very big things like eats Jupiter in the bottom photograph. And it can do that precisely because it can make more copies of itself by absorbing matter from around itself. This sounds a lot like biology, if you ask me. So my my sort of operating hypothesis is that synthetic biology is going to be one of the technologies that lets us go from where we are today to a type 1 civilization, a civilization that makes full use of the energy incident upon its disk, its planet's disk. And I want to tell you why I believe this. So biology already channels about 130 terawatts of solar power. That's about 6 times the power use of civilization. And it does this at no cost, and basically with very little to no human intervention. And it gives us all these amazing capabilities. Things like room temperature and room pressure catalysis. I think that was the first thing that I sort of really understood about biology. Many of the industrial processes that we rely upon today, I think the most famous being the Haber-Bosch process. But every synthesis process for plastics, every oil refining process, they all happen at high temperatures and high pressures. And yet biology has figured out how to do all of them at room temperature and room pressure. Can self-assemble, can self-repair. It can fix CO2. And it can transform the redox state of metals. So it can dissolve minerals or it can reform them. And it can make materials like spider silk with amazing rheological properties. And you could think of all these applications that it might have, like very, very efficient photosynthesis, making carbon neutral biofuels, making very lightweight materials, enabling the safe use of nuclear power, mining rare, precious elements for sustainable energy technology, making batteries, storing electricity. And so we think that applied biology could it's revolutionized medicine, no doubt, right? It continues to do so. You could imagine it doing the same for energy. And I want to talk about 3 examples where we're making some progress on this. First of all, traditional mining, the sustainable energy economy of the 21st century is going to need a stupendous amount of metals, things like copper, nickel, cobalt, lithium, you name it, rare earth elements. It will need more metal than has been mined in all of human history many times over. But unfortunately, mining, I once heard a quip that, and there's some truth to this, that mining hasn't evolved significantly since the time of the Romans. What we have to do is we have to figure out ways to use much more of the rock that we mine, so we don't end up with a planet full of holes. Above in this photograph, simulated photograph, there's a ball of copper. To get that ball of copper, you would have to dig that hole. So we mine copper is one of the more efficiently mined elements. if we have to figure out a way to use to get metals, often at low concentration, out of the rest of that rock and put them into sustainable energy technologies. Now, biology gives us an existence proof for how to do this better. A few years ago, my lab sketched out a sort of a roadmap for building biotechnologies for mining. So on the right-hand side, in the red, you've got a traditional thermochemical or sort of hydrometallurgical process for mining. But on the right, in the green, you've got a bioprocess for doing this. We think we could harness mineral and metal interacting microbes to make the green process. And in fact, there are existence proofs. There are microbes in nature that exist today that can do these steps. They just don't do them very well. We could engineer those microbes only if we understand how they work much better. So my lab was able to understand and then engineer microbes that dissolve rare earth element containing minerals and then separate rare earth elements. Rare earths, they're actually not that rare. There's 16 of them: scandium, yttrium, and then the 14 lanthanides on the periodic table. They're not actually that rare. They are rare, say, compared to iron, the rock-forming elements like iron, but they're actually not that rare compared to, say, iridium or platinum. But they are extremely difficult to separate. They're always dilute in rock. You have to excavate tons of rock just to get grams of rare earth out. There's no way to sidestep this process because you never find a seam of rare earth elements. And even when you do, they're all co-dissolved. And they're all extremely chemically similar. So separating them is one of the hardest challenges in chemistry. So the first thing we did was we looked at a microbe called Gluconobacter. And it's known to dissolve the types of rocks that contain rare earth elements, phosphate minerals like monazite and bastnasite. My first postdoc, Alexa Schmitz, she built what's called a knockout collection of Gluconobacter, where she deleted every gene systematically so we can test what every gene does. We can see how the bug performs. When I say bug, I mean microbe, how it performs in the absence of a single gene. And what this does is it tells you which genes are important and which ones aren't. And that gives you a roadmap for engineering. And with this, we were able to make an almost 1,200% improvement in its ability to dissolve monazite, a mineral that is common in the Chinese deposits of rare earths. There's also a component of fly ash, which is a product of coal burning. In fact, just in upstate New York, on the back of the envelope math suggests there's enough fly ash sitting around from centuries of coal burning that we could extract enough rare earths to build enough wind turbines to power New York City 7 times over. Put hundreds of thousands of electric vehicles on the road. On the right, we looked at another bug called Shigella onadensis and later Vibrio nitrogens. These microbes, they can selectively biosorb rare earth elements. Rare earths can selectively stick to their surfaces. And that gives you an ability to separate rare earths. My grad student, Sean Medin, who was able to understand how this process works at the genetic level, he was able to engineer a 200% improvement in biosorption and a potentially 47% reduction in separation process length. And this allows, and this is especially true for adjacent heavy rare earth, probably the hardest rare earths to separate. What this does is it lets that technology leapfrog conventional solvent extractions for separations. Sean and Alexa were so successful in this, they started a company called Regen to commercialize this technology and develop it further. Next, let's say we do build all this sustainable energy technology, all the electric cars, all the wind turbines, all the nuclear reactors. And we do this by the middle of the century, as the IPCC, as the UN hopes that we do. We're still going to have a huge amount of excess CO2 in the atmosphere that will continue to warm it for centuries to come. So we have to remove, we passed that point a long time ago, where we could deal with climate change just by cutting emissions. Somehow we have to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And there's no technology out there that really has the right combination of speed, scale, affordability to do this. So we said, let's turn to nature. Eventually, nature will deal with all the excess CO2 in the atmosphere through a process called weathering, where ultrasilicate minerals, including the ultramafic mineral olivine, which is shown in green on the left, they get slowly dissolved by rainwater. And they release metal ions like iron and magnesium, predominantly magnesium. And then that magnesium reacts with CO2 and makes another rock like magnesite, which is shown on the right. So you turn one rock into another rock and lock up CO2 for millions of years. There's some evidence, growing evidence, that this process is accelerated in nature by microbes. It can also release nickel and cobalt. You'll see them in the middle of the screen that you can use in sustainable energy technologies. The only problem is that this process naturally takes somewhere between thousands and tens of thousands of years to clear the excess CO2 in the atmosphere. This was true after the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, where the temperature spike took tens of thousands of years to go away. So we said, well, could we use the same strategy we used to biomine rare earth to mine ultramafic rocks for magnesium that we can use for CO2 sequestration? So we're building what we call the Microbe-Mineral Atlas to figure out how to accelerate mineral dissolution, sequester CO2, and then power sustainable energy technologies. We think that microbes have got at least 5 mechanisms for interacting with metals and rocks. We're trying to harness all of them. Have acid production. This is probably the best known. But we've also got things like chelation, redox transformation. These things all dissolve rocks. We've also got precipitation, hyperaccumulation, and biosorption that can be used for separation and concentration as well. We're trying to understand all of these mechanisms and harness all of them for new mining technologies. My next example are microbes that directly eat electricity and CO2. And this has got loads of potential benefits. The high efficiency conversion of solar electricity and CO2 to chemicals could be possible. It could be very cheap as well. This potentially doesn't need something like hydrogen, a volatile intermediate. In nature, there are microbes that can do each step of this process. There are some microbes that can eat electricity. There are some that can eat CO2. There are others that can make something close, components of gasoline, plastics. But there's no microbe that can do every step of this process, that can do all in one. And we didn't understand, when I started as a faculty member, we didn't understand much about the physics and the biology of this process. We certainly didn't understand if it was worth the effort to pull off, if it was worth trying the incredible effort required to genetically engineer this, which even then I understood would not be easy. Now, solar photovoltaics have faced this is it worth it question too. It's in the late 1950s, shortly after they were first built at Bell Labs. The efficiency for solar to electricity was a handful of percent at best. And solar panels were really good for powering satellites and mailboxes, and that was about it. Shockley, who invented the field effect transistor, and Quasar, one of his employees at Shockley Semiconductor, the first sort of semiconductor company in Silicon Valley, they laid out a theory for the ultimate efficiency of PV. We now call it the Shockley-Quasar limit. And what they did was they told people what would happen if they followed their roadmap. So today, 65 years after this paper was published, or 64 years, PV's on an exponential cost reduction curve, and it's almost at its ultimate efficiency, and it's poised to power the planet. So I said, what we really need is a theory that predicts the upper limit efficiency of electron-eating microbes. And it turns out, so we used sort of advanced genetics to figure out the mechanism of electron uptake. And then we were able to build a theory that predicts its upper limit efficiency. And it turns out it could be very, very efficient. It could far exceed even the theoretical upper limit efficiency of photosynthesis by almost a factor of 2. And I think that achieving that upper limit efficiency will be much, much easier than achieving the upper limit efficiency of crops in practice. Finally, how do we make this happen? All of what I've said sounds like it might be at the outer limit of possibility of genetic engineering. And I think it is. I don't think that it is possible with the current generation of genetic engineering technology. Traditional molecular and synthetic biology is very capital dependent. If you go to my lab, it's full of expensive freezers, incubators, shakers, you name it. People are there all hours. Even doing that, it's very difficult to make progress, especially on challenges like fixing CO2. So 2 of my postdocs, David Specht and Bryce Brownfield, they've come up with a new technique for DNA uptake. And what it does is it removes all the expensive equipment that's traditionally needed in genetic engineering. And it allows for a massive scale up of genetic engineering as well. And they've been so successful in this, they're starting a company called Forage Evolution to further commercialize and develop this technology as well. So now, I'd just like to dwell briefly on the penultimate term in the Drake equation. Can we recognize it if we were to see an alien civilization, or if an alien were to look at us? Would they recognize us as being intelligent and worth communicating with? Now, all of this increased energy use might sound actually quite scary. And I don't think it is. I really want to stress that if there's one thing you come away with, if there's one message I hope that I could try to convey to you, is I actually don't think we should think of it as scary. I think we should think about it as an opportunity. I think that humanity as a whole. You might be able to point to some individuals who, you think disagree with this, but I think humanity as a whole cares more about the environment today than any other point in human history. Um, and I think that sentiment, will continue well into the future. I think future civilizations will not care less; they will care more than we do. And I think that the future actually will look beautiful, right? Like it'll look way more like the artist's illustration of what's called the Tree of Life, um, that I stole from the New Contact book on the left. It'll look way more like that than the image of the Bionobo rare earth mine that I've put on the right. Um, and, we might not see aliens, in fact, because they've chosen to preserve the beauty of their home planets, right? We might look at them, oh, there's nothing here. It looks like wilderness. I can only hope. Um, so my final thoughts for you are, how do you make this happen? Like, how do how do you persuade governments, donors to fund the development of this sort of technology? Um, and I'd like to dwell briefly on how modern research is organized. So, uh, the modern American scientific funding system, it was conceived by a guy called Vannevar Bush, and his photograph is, well, there are three photos of him. Top left, there's him in the 1940s. Below him, played by Matthew Modine in Oppenheimer, and then him on the cover of a report that he wrote to President Roosevelt at the end of the war, called The Endless Frontier, where he lays out an extremely compelling case for why the government should fund basic scientific research. Prior to this, the US government hadn't really engaged in this at all. But throughout World War II, nuclear physics, electrodynamics, aerodynamics, it all produced sort of war-winning weapons. Nuclear power and nuclear weapons, radar, jet engines. Bush said, you don't have, you get these things by funding basic science, so fund basic science. And that argument has been incredibly successful. But this framework, this sort of linear way of thinking about how what research is, it has a major blind spot. And this is not to say that Bush was an idiot. You could argue he was one of the geniuses of the 20th century. I certainly couldn't have done any better. But 50 years after The Endless Frontier, Don Stokes, who was a professor of public policy at Princeton, came up with a revised way to look at this. And he thought about science not in one dimension, but in two dimensions. He says, let's think about this as a square. On the x-axis, the horizontal axis, we're going to put consideration of use. And then on the vertical axis, we're going to put quest for fundamental understanding. And you can divide this into 4 quadrants. Oops. In the top left, we've got the Bohr quadrant. This is pure basic research. A high, very fundamental, but very low, purely curiosity driven. And in this, we see things like quantum mechanics, general relativity, nuclear physics, and things like bacterial immunity. How do bacteria protect themselves against viruses? Things that, nobody was thinking about how to use these things when they first posed the question. Then, in the bottom right, we've got the Edison quadrant, and this is purely applied. You've got things like light bulbs, integrated circuits, spacecraft. There's very little quest for fundamental understanding here, but there's a very high consideration of use. And there are some technologies that can directly cross over between these quadrants. So, for instance, nuclear power and CRISPR, you go from bacterial immunity to gene editing. You could do it sort of in a single step. But I would argue, and Stokes argues, that there are many more technologies that need a little bit more of a push. He says, let's think about a third quadrant. He calls it the Pasteur's quadrant. And he named his book after it. And this is use-inspired basic research. So it combines high consideration of use with very high quest for fundamental understanding. You see things like pasteurization, transistors, and solid-state physics, optical fibers, aviation, right? If you think about it, the Wright brothers had to figure out the fundamentals of aerodynamics in order to get their plane off the ground. Molecular biology, antibiotics, dwarf wheat, and mRNA vaccines most recently. All of these start out in the Bohr quadrant. They incubate in the Pasteur quadrant. And only then can they move into the Edison quadrant. I would argue the reason that, over the past few decades, several academics and commentators, venture capitalists, I would say most famously, the Princeton economist Robert Gordon, the economist Tyler Cowen, and the venture capitalist Peter Thiel have said the rate of technological progress has slowed. And I would argue it's because we haven't paid enough attention to this Pasteur's quadrant in the past few decades. You'll notice, I think with the exception of antibiotics, all of these examples were funded by private entities. Aviation was funded by the Wright brothers bicycle store. mRNA vaccines by the some say patients or sufferants of the University of Pennsylvania. Optical fibers, solid state physics, or Bell Labs, a state-sponsored monopoly. Very, very little. The only one I can think of is antibiotics that was funded by the British government. Very little or none by the US federal government. And so the US government have kind of lost the muscle memory of how to do this. And I think that we have to, when we are, I believe, starting to better appreciate this part of science. Finally, there's the people aspect as well. And one of my favorite bits of the movie Contact is the contrast between Ellie, the heroine, and Drumlin, her former boss. And Ellie is a weirdo, misfit dreamer, and Drumlin is the arch careerist. And I think, though, that real breakthroughs in technology, they do kind of need weirdos and misfits. I think Kathleen Carrico is perhaps the best real-world example of this. You've got to empower those people somehow, and we've got to understand, I think, how the academic and the sort of technological system, creates and hinders opportunities for them. And we've got to create opportunities inside and outside of academia. The last thought I'll leave you with is there's loads to play for here. We shouldn't handicap ourselves by short-term thinking. There's so much to create in this century, and so much good that can be done with it. We would be foolish if we didn't take the risk. And with that, I will call it the end, and I'm open for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Buzz. That was great. And we will open it up for questions. You can either, well, I think given the size of the group tonight, we've got 63 with us tonight. I will see if you raise your hand using the raise your hand button under the React tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen. that'll move you to the list of folks to the top of the list of folks I see. So go ahead and raise hands, and if you don't, roll. Good to see you. Go ahead, unmute yourself if you'd like.
Hi, Buzz.
Hello, and Roll. Thank you for coming.
Oh,
Yes, good to
great
see you.
story. So let me give you a contrarian opinion about something. There was one
Yes.
quadrant that was empty. That was low understanding and low use.
Yeah, so I don't think Stokes, I think somebody has called this the Tinker's Quadrant.
Right.
And
Yeah,
I think it's very disparaging to tinkerers.
yes. So I would give an argument that one way to move to that quadrant, not that one wants to, but one way is to use artificial intelligence unintelligently. And that will get you a better product, but with less understanding.
Oh.
That is, you can perfect the enzyme system, you can perfect the molecule that binds to CRISPR, but you do it by the modern day computer equivalent of no thinking. But you can turn it into something useful. What you want to do is to use. So I wanted you to fight that. That's why I've said it so provocatively.
I actually agree with you then. That's
Uh,
I
I
actually.
think that using artificial intelligence lowers understanding of any situation unless it's done by a clever human being. That's you. So tell us about different uses of artificial intelligence in your work.
So I'm going to I'm skip forward. I'll skip back a few slides to here. So when DNA manipulation technology was invented in the 1970s, um, the sort of the bottleneck on editing a genome was really your ability to make the mutagenic DNA. Getting the DNA into the microbe to do its business, say to add a gene for CO2 fixation, wasn't really a problem. It was like the least of your worries. Designing that thing that you were going to put in was very difficult. Today, though, thanks to artificial intelligence technology, um, for instance, I think the most famous example of this is AlphaFold and Rosetta, two AI technologies. Maybe Rosetta is like an expert system that recently won the Nobel Prize. It's very, very easy to design proteins, and it's very easy to turn them um, into DNA because the costs of DNA synthesis have plummeted since the 1990s. Now, as a result of this, the bottleneck is no now. So Rosetta and sort of AlphaFold, they can sort of get a protein structure right. They can sort of now AlphaFold can't design a de novo protein, but Rosetta can. You sort of come up, you say you want to do this catalytic job. So Rosetta will design a protein sequence that sort of does it. But if the PhD I did with Sol Gruner and that you've helped me out with taught me anything, it's that protein function is exquisitely sensitive to protein structure at the sort of tenth of an angstrom scale. And even the best design tools that we have today are nowhere close to that level of precision. So your only recourse is to design tens of thousands, if not millions, of slightly different variants of that sequence that you want to do something. And this, it's very easy to come up with tens of thousands and millions of variants, because that's only a very, very small amount of sequence space. So how do you get those into the bug? And it turns out that all this stuff on the top, which I will show here, all these shakers and incubators and sort of electric zapping machines, they place an enormous bottleneck. And so the number of sequences that you can explore isn't millions, it's not hundreds of thousands, it's more like tens to thousands at best. And so your ability to find the best sequence out of an ensemble that's been generated by AI is very limited. So your ability to do sort of unintelligent things is quite limited. But the natural competence method, we show this in blue in the bottom bar, it isn't bottlenecked. So what we can do is we can print out with a DNA printer millions of different variants of an enzyme that are very similar, but have sort of significant differences between them. And we can transform them all very, very easily because it can be done at room temperature. It can be done, it doesn't need the electric zap. It can be very, very cheap. And so what we think it will enable us is to sort of do a semi-intelligent prediction and then test it very unintelligently. That might be able to make your computer model of how a protein works even more intelligent. I hope that answers your question.
Other questions? And did that answer your question, Roald?
Roald, you might be muted.
Yeah. And Rob's got a hand up.
Yeah,
let's. Oh, yeah.
I'll let somebody else ask something, but we can talk later about it.
Okay. I'll catch you, Roald. I will definitely happy to talk to you about it.
Go ahead, Rob.
Buzz, you've given us so much to think about. Many of the people in the audience this evening are from the evolution of the earth and life class, and I'm just pondering these relationships between your taking these materials, minerals, and bacteria that have billions of years of history, and we're kind of accelerating the processes using both of those things. I'm not sure what to make of that, but you're using these inherently ancient lineages and geologic processes to accelerate human progress. This is kind of mind-blowing. Okay, so what's my question? My question is fairly down to earth. So going back to biomining and looking for rare earth metals and so on, even with this even with these alternative processes that are more environmentally sustainable, I imagine there's still a certain amount of mining that's necessary. I don't know exactly how to quantify this question, but how much is it possible to comment on the degree to which we would be doing a lot less mining because these methods are more efficient, or the degree to which we'll just do the same amount because we'll also want to accelerate our access to those metals, or whether it, and I'm sure part of it is just that at some point we will simply run out of easy access, and so this will enable us to get at things that we couldn't previously. Is there any way to comment on those ratios?
That is a really good question. I don't know the answer to this actually. Like and I actually probably should actually know the answer, or I should be able to like have a good sense, like a sort of intelligent answer for this. I would hope that what this, I don't think you're right. Actually, it might, the increased availability of metals um, might spur people to use metals more potentially, right? But let's just say, right, and maybe it will, right? But let's say, that it doesn't. Yeah, there's some other bottleneck, right? Like, so there might be. Um, the total amount of metals, say, in a biomining versus a non-biomining future, let's say it doesn't change that much. In the biomining future, I would hope that the number of holes that we have to dig goes down by quite a lot, because for every sort of like if you think about, say, the oil industry, right? Like it's you can say a lot of bad things about it, but it is extremely efficient. And so, every molecule in a barrel of oil kind of gets used, right? Like they waste very, very little. They turn it into, they turn it into gasoline, they turn it into kerosene, turn it into alcohol, they turn it into plastics, lubricants. You name it, right? I think there was once I saw this thing called the oil tree, right, where you've got, sort of a barrel of oil branches out into all of these different products, too many to count. And this was done in the 1920s, and apparently, if you were to do this today, it would look more like a sort of a pine cone, like a pine tree. My hope is that we sort of learn to do something similar with a sort of a pile of rock, where we today, we just take the single metal that's, easiest to get and is most enriched in that pile of rock, and then we make a pile out of everything that's left. Um, and I would hope that we reduce that a lot, and we may in fact reduce it sort of at a greater rate. I would hope. Yeah, this is nothing more than hope, by the way, but we reduce it by more than our appetite for metals increases. Again, I hope, and that maybe we throw it, we kind of throw the rocks back in the ground, sort of from where they came, and then we also, the same technology that can be used for biomining can also be used for recycling as well, and we're much more serious about recycling than we are today as well. Um, um, I hope that answers your question. It probably wasn't everything, but
Yeah,
I hope you
well,
got something out of it.
Sure. It's impossible to answer, but I wondered which way you leaned on that, and of course it's probably going to matter on, I mean, economics and policies will also play a role in this. But anyway, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, and I put in the chat that Rob's question relates to Jevons paradox. Are you familiar with Jevons paradox, Buzz?
Actually, no, I'm not. You're gonna have to tell me. You're gonna have to.
Oh, I put in a link to the Wikipedia article on it in the first sentence or two, which is, in economics, the Jevons paradox is sometimes the Jevons effect occurs when technological progress increases the efficiency with which a resource is used, reducing the amount necessary for any one use, but the falling cost of use induces increases in demand enough that the resource use is increased rather than reduced.
Which I think I'm sort of inherently betting against this
Yes.
effect, and maybe I'm completely wrong to be doing this. Maybe it's a really bad bet.
Yeah,
It
I
probably is.
yeah, the Jevons the Jevons effect doesn't always play out, and I think some people think that it does, and I think there's pretty good evidence that it happens sometimes, but not all the time. We are using lights more than we used to because they're lower. They're so much more efficient than they were before, but we're not using enough so that it matches the power demand that we used to have for lighting. So I think it's relevant some of the time, but it's an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah.
Other questions? And I have more myself.
I'm happy to take them as well. I'm like seriously happy to keep
Yeah.
answering questions.
Well, one thing that came to mind when talking about the search for extraterrestrials and the Drake equation and that sort of thing is the interesting observation that we cannot speak with species on our own planet, yet we think we'll be able to do that with species from a different planet. And I think that's a very interesting idea to ponder. A little different from most of what you were talking about, but I think very interesting.
Yeah.
And another question of a different flavor is, how'd you get interested in this?
I get interested in this. I think how did I get interested in it? I think it started out as a teenager. Um, I read a lot of sci-fi, watched a lot of sci-fi, and saw things that looked like biology. I think reading like Arthur C. Clarke, um, especially sort of maybe think, oh, this biology thing is kind of interesting. But at school in England, biology was really boring. It was like cutting up frogs and sheep, and that didn't really strike me as very interesting. And I was a physics undergrad, but I was in my last year as an undergrad. I worked for a biotech startup for my undergraduate advisor, and I thought, God, this is the sort of biology I want to do, and I thought this is really interesting. And I was very lucky that my PhD was with Saul Gruner in biophysics, and I think that gave somebody who was sort of quantitatively minded a way to think about biology that was, sort of unusual, I think. And it sort of created an opportunity a very rare opportunity to think about biology in a different way. Um, and then, I think that like Katrina happened, and I thought, God, somebody's got to, there is this deep problem of climate change, and I'd been aware of it, but maybe hadn't quite dawned on me how serious it was. And then I was like, well, okay, somebody's got to do something about this, and might as well be me, right?
Right,
I
right.
think I think like I might as well give it a shot, right? Like you know, it's sort of I think that was it really, um, and I was just sort of kind of been very lucky to that people have tolerated me doing this for quite a while since then. Um,
Great. And another question is, have you seen Ed Buckler talk about replacing the Haber-Bosch process? Do you know Ed?
I I know him. I've not talked about replacing the Haber-Bosch process, but I would love to.
It's
Yeah, I
very
would love to
interesting.
replace it. Yeah,
Yeah,
I think biology, if you think about it, has
yeah,
given us the existence proof for how to do it,
yeah.
and do it
He's
very
got some very
efficiently.
interesting ideas about it, and I have been intending to ask him to come on and talk about this, and so maybe we'll have him on in the fall. I can actually send you a PowerPoint of his that's fascinating, but he probably has updated it since I've seen it. So talk to him directly. So Ed Buckler is a corn geneticist corn scientist at Cornell. For those who don't know who Ed is. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you so much. I will put in the chat again some links where you can donate to help support science in the virtual pub, and you can follow the link to see what's coming up. And the last link there is missing the E. That's supposed to be our YouTube channel. Let me paste that in again and add that E. There you go. And that'll take you to our YouTube channel where you can see a recording of tonight's talk under the live tab, and you can find most of the earlier talks as well there, as well as linked from the second of those 3 links. And thanks so much, and I'm game to stick around if others have questions. Great talk.
Thank you, Buzz. That was amazing.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yes. Yes, and a note in closing is that Buzz has got a grant that PRI is working with him on, that this is really the first event of that collaboration.
That's right. And in fact, you guys are going to help test this hyper-engineerable microbe in the hands of school children, hopefully, and teachers.
Yep.
Sure.
Thank you, Buzz.
Yes, roll. Yeah, please. Yes. Ask away.
No, I was just thanking you.
Oh, thank you for coming.
Always good to see you, Roll, and other folks.
Roll, and I'm happy. Honestly, I am happy to have the conversation with you now if you want, or I could do it some other time.
And hello, Karen. Haven't seen you for a while.
We'll have it some other time.
Okay.
Okay.
All right, I'm going to click the end button. Thanks, one and all, and we will see you